Welcome. Tonight, we begin a long and gentle journey into the story of the Roman Empire, a civilization that shaped laws, cities, armies, languages, and ideas that still surround us today. Over the next hours, we will explore Rome slowly and quietly, starting from small villages on the banks of the Tiber and traveling all the way to the height of imperial power. If you enjoy this kind of historical storytelling, feel free to like the topic. It helps bring more calm history content to you. Now, let us begin the story of Rome. The origins of Rome. The story of Rome begins not with mighty emperors or grand legions, but with land, the land of central Italy, where rolling hills met long stretches of fertile plains. The region was a crossroads between older civilizations of the Mediterranean and the many tribes scattered across the peninsula. Long before the word Rome meant anything, this land was home to shepherds, farmers, traders, and travelers following the river valleys. Along the Tiber River, early communities settled on a group of hills that offered protection from floods and from raiders. These hills would later become famous, each with its own role in Roman tradition. The Capitoline, the Aventine, the Celian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, and the most legendary of all, the Palatine Hill. Life here was simple. Families grew grain, raised livestock, and occasionally traded with passing merchants from the nearby coasts. The climate, mild and predictable, allowed them to plant and harvest in steady cycles. The river carried fish, supplied water, and served as a natural highway for goods. Little by little, the scattered groups of huts began to resemble a rough settlement. Rome's earliest identity was shaped by its neighbors. To the north lived the Etruscans, skilled builders, metalworkers, and traders. To the south lived the Greek colonies, bringers of writing systems, cultural practices, and myths. Between them lived the Latin tribes, who settled the region where Rome would rise. The mixture of Etruscan, Greek, and Latin influences would eventually give Rome a unique cultural foundation. But in these early days, everything remained small, local, and fragile. As generations passed, the settlements on the hills slowly grew. Paths turned into roads. Wooden fences turned into small walls. And stories began to spread, stories of ancestors, of spirits, and eventually, of a pair of twins said to have been raised by a she-wolf. These stories were more than myth. They created a shared identity among the people who would eventually call themselves Romans. The land around the Tiber was not yet a capital, nor a republic, nor an empire. It was a collection of families working together for survival. They had no king yet, no senate, no armies, and no ambitions beyond the next season. But the location, with access to the sea, fertile land, and natural defenses, quietly shaped their future. Geography was Rome's first advantage. In these early centuries, the people lived in small round huts with thatched roofs. Their tools were simple, made of bronze or early iron. Their gods were connected to the earth, the forests, the rivers, spirits believed to protect or punish depending on how the people lived. Festivals marked harvests, sowings, and the turning of the seasons. Life was steady, cyclical, and deeply tied to the land. But as the community grew, so did the need for leadership, structure, and coordination. And slowly, the early Romans began forming the foundations of what would later become one of the world's most complex systems of governance. This is where the long story truly begins, in a cluster of huts on a group of hills, among ordinary people, unaware that their settlement would one day command the entire Mediterranean. As the settlement on the hills grew, a sense of unity slowly formed among the families living there. Paths between the hills became more frequently traveled. People shared tools, traded goods, and helped one another during harvests or when danger approached. At the base of these hills lay a low, marshy area. Over time, this space became a natural meeting point. People gathered there to exchange grain, livestock, pottery, and stories from their daily lives. Even though it was little more than muddy ground, it served as the heart of the early community. One day, long in the future, this very spot would become the Roman Forum, the political and commercial center of Rome. But for now, it was simply a gathering place of simple huts and busy hands. The early Romans did not yet see themselves as special or destined for greatness. Their concerns were practical. They worked to keep their crops safe from flooding, their livestock protected from wolves, and their families warm through the colder months. But quietly, their society was developing traits that would later define Rome: discipline, organization, and a strong respect for tradition. As generations passed, the community grew large enough to require rules, not formal laws yet, but customs. Elders gave advice, mediated disputes, and preserved stories of ancestors. These elders were respected, not because they commanded power, but because they carried the memory of the people. They knew the cycles of the seasons, the rituals of the gods, and the wisdom learned from hardship. Their voices guided the community when challenges arose. One of the earliest challenges was competition for resources. The land around the Tiber was fertile, desirable, and watched closely by neighboring tribes. Some sought peaceful trade, while others tried to seize land or livestock. Conflicts were usually small, involving brief clashes between groups of farmers defending their homes. But these moments taught the early Romans something important. Unity brought strength. To defend themselves, the men of the settlement formed simple militias. They used small shields, spears, and early iron tools adapted into weapons. They were not trained soldiers yet, but their willingness to organize set them apart from many neighboring communities. Over time, this instinct for structured defense would evolve into the disciplined Roman army the world remembers. Religious practices also shaped daily life. The Romans believed in countless spirits, protectors of homes, fields, and rivers. They left offerings of grain, wine, or small carved objects, hoping to earn favor or avoid misfortune. Every important activity, from planting seeds to starting a journey, was accompanied by a ritual. These practices created a shared rhythm for the community, reinforcing a sense of identity long before the word Roman had any political meaning. As the population grew, the settlement began to take on the early shape of a town. Wooden posts strengthened the boundaries. Small paths connected families. A sense of belonging formed. These people saw themselves as part of something larger than their individual households. A name began to circulate, derived from the region, the river, and early legends. Slowly, the settlement became known as Roma. This early Rome was still fragile. It had no grand buildings, no armies, no political system, and no kings. But it had all the ingredients that would later allow it to rise: a strategic location, a hard-working population, and a natural instinct for cooperation. As the first century of Rome's existence drew to a close, new stories began to shape the community's identity. Tales of heroic ancestors emerged, some real, some imagined. The story of the twins Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf, became one of these foundational myths. Whether it happened exactly as told mattered less than the meaning behind it. Rome saw itself as a city born from struggle, survival, and the protection of something greater. We will remain in this early period a while longer, following the slow formation of the first political ideas, the influence of the Etruscans, and the transformation of Rome from a cluster of huts into a small but ambitious town. As the settlement continued to grow, the early Romans relied increasingly on cooperation. Families who had once lived independently now shared responsibilities, guarding the riverbanks, maintaining footpaths, and organizing seasonal work. With this cooperation came the natural rise of leaders, not yet kings or officials, but respected figures who guided the community through experience and wisdom. These early leaders were chosen informally. They were elders, skilled farmers, or individuals who had proven themselves during disputes with neighboring tribes. Their influence came from trust rather than authority. When the community faced decisions, where to plant new crops, how to fortify the hills, or how to respond to an outside threat, people turned to these elders for direction. Over time, these small decisions formed the basis of early Roman governance. The Romans valued order, even from the beginning. They created traditions around leadership to ensure stability. These traditions were passed down through generations, eventually evolving into the political structures that would define the republic. But for now, the system remained simple and flexible. The settlement also grew more organized in its physical layout. Families began building sturdier homes, replacing temporary materials with more permanent ones. Storage pits were dug for grain. Small shrines were placed at crossroads and near homes to honor protective spirits. Trails connecting the hills became more defined, gradually forming the earliest streets of Rome. The marshy area between the hills, the future Roman Forum, played an increasingly central role. People gathered there daily to exchange goods and news. Farmers brought vegetables, grain, and livestock. Craftsmen displayed pottery, tools, and simple ornaments. As this gathering place grew, it became the heart of Rome's social and economic life. Meanwhile, Rome's neighbors continued to influence its development. The Etruscans, living to the north, were known for their advanced engineering skills. They built roads, bridges, and structures far more sophisticated than anything the early Romans could yet create. Trade with the Etruscans brought new tools, ideas, and cultural practices to Rome. From the Greek colonies in the south came writing, artistic ideas, and myths. Traders from these colonies brought pottery decorated with scenes of gods and heroes. These images helped shape Roman stories and religious practices. In time, Rome would adapt many Greek ideas to suit its own character, blending them into something unique. As Rome's identity formed, the early Romans began to distinguish themselves from surrounding tribes. They developed customs that emphasized family loyalty, duty to the community, and respect for tradition. These values became deeply rooted and would later influence Roman law, politics, and daily life. Even in these simple beginnings, the Romans showed a strong connection to the concept of ancestry. They believed that the spirits of their forefathers watched over them, guiding and protecting the community. This belief encouraged them to preserve stories and customs, passing them down from one generation to the next. The willingness to adopt new ideas while holding firmly to tradition became one of Rome's defining strengths. Rome absorbed influences from its neighbors without losing its own character. This flexibility would later help the Romans manage a vast empire with diverse cultures. As the first hills became fully settled and the Forum grew busier, the small community on the Tiber River was no longer just a gathering of families. It had become an emerging town with shared customs, shared responsibilities, and shared aspirations. The early Romans may not have realized it yet, but the foundations of one of history's greatest civilizations were already forming beneath their feet. The next gradual step in Rome's story involved the emergence of kings, the influence of Etruscan rulers, and the building of the earliest public structures. These early transformations would shape Rome for centuries to come. As the early Roman settlement expanded, the community faced challenges that required more structured leadership than the elders alone could provide. Conflicts with neighboring tribes grew more frequent, trade increased, and the population became large enough that shared customs needed clearer organization. From these pressures emerged the earliest kings of Rome, figures who combined religious authority, military command, and community leadership. These early kings were not emperors, nor even rulers in the later Roman sense. Their authority came partly from tradition, partly from respect, and partly from the belief that the gods favored their leadership. The Romans saw their rulers as protectors of the people and guardians of sacred rituals. In a world where spiritual and daily life were completely intertwined, this role was essential. The first kings were likely chosen by leading families, supported by the approval of the community and by religious signs. Their responsibilities were practical: to lead defensive efforts, organize festivals, settle disputes, and oversee the growing town. Over time, These responsibilities developed into recognizable institutions, the early forms of Roman kingship and advisory councils. One figure stood out in later Roman memory, Romulus. Whether historical or legendary, he became a symbol of early leadership. Stories told that Romulus organized the first Roman Senate, gathering influential elders to advise him. This group, called the patres, or fathers, would later become the foundation for the patrician class. These early advisory roles helped shape Rome's political character, a blend of monarchy, aristocracy, and tradition. The kings also oversaw the formation of the earliest Roman army. What had once been small militias became more organized groups. Men were divided by age and ability, forming simple units. They trained with spears and shields, preparing to defend their growing town. Military service was seen as a duty to the community, and this sense of obligation would become a cornerstone of Roman identity. As Rome grew more structured, the physical landscape began to change. One of the most important early developments was the drainage of the marshlands between the hills. The Etruscans, with their advanced engineering knowledge, played a key role in this transformation. Through careful planning and labor, they built channels that carried water away from the low-lying ground. This area, once muddy and unstable, became firm enough to support buildings and public spaces. In time, this space became the Roman Forum, the beating heart of political, social, and economic life. Today, the ruins of this area are filled with arches and temples, but in these early days, it was simple, open ground used for markets, gatherings, and religious ceremonies. The kings also established important religious sites. Small temples and altars began to appear around the settlement, marking places where the Romans honored their gods. These early structures were modest, built of wood and clay, but they carried deep importance. The Romans believed that their success depended on proper rituals, and the kings ensured that these rituals were performed with care. Trade with neighboring communities continued to expand. The Tiber River made Rome a natural stop for merchants traveling inland from the coast. They brought goods from across the Mediterranean: olive oil, wine, fine pottery, and metalwork. In return, the Romans offered grain, livestock, and locally crafted items. Through these exchanges, Rome gained wealth and new ideas. The community also grew more diverse. People from nearby regions moved to Rome, attracted by its location and opportunities. This mixture of backgrounds added new customs, new skills, and new perspectives. Rome became a place of blending cultures, a process that would continue throughout its history. As the settlement entered the later years of its first era, it was no longer a fragile gathering of huts. Rome had kings, an advisory council, a growing population, improved defenses, and a central meeting place. It had become a structured town with a clear identity, confident, ambitious, and ready to shape its destiny. The next transformation would come with the Etruscan influence at its height, when engineering, art, and political organization elevated Rome from a simple town to an emerging power. These developments would set the stage for the creation of monumental architecture, expanded religious practices, and the eventual rise of the Roman Republic. As Rome entered a new stage of growth, the influence of the Etruscans became one of the most important forces shaping its early identity. The Etruscans lived just to the north, in a region rich with skilled artisans, traders, and engineers. Their towns were larger and more advanced than early Rome, with paved streets, strong walls, and impressive temples. Contact with these neighbors did not merely bring trade, it brought transformation. The Romans began adopting Etruscan practices in many aspects of life. Etruscan builders introduced new architectural techniques, especially in constructing arches, drainage systems, and early public buildings. Their knowledge helped the Romans improve the small wooden structures that dotted the hills. With this guidance, Rome developed sturdier foundations and more organized spaces. One of the most remarkable projects of this time was the continued development of the drainage system in the Forum Valley. What had started as simple channels grew into the early form of the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest known sewage systems. Though it would become more advanced in later centuries, its beginnings during this early era represented a significant step for a town transforming into a true city. With improved engineering came more ambitious construction. Early kings, some of whom were strongly influenced by Etruscan customs, encouraged the building of shrines, meeting spaces, and gathering areas. Temples began to appear on the Capitoline Hill, dedicated to the gods who protected the community. These early temples were not yet the grand marble structures Rome would one day build, but they symbolized growing organization and stability. Daily life in Rome also changed under Etruscan influence. Clothing styles became more elaborate, with patterned fabrics and decorative pins. New musical instruments appeared in ceremonies. More organized religious rituals were introduced, many focusing on reading signs and interpreting the will of the gods. This practice, known as augury, became deeply rooted in Roman tradition. The kings of Rome during this era played key roles in shaping the city's future. Among them, the later traditions especially remember Numa Pompilius, who was associated with establishing early religious and social customs. Though details of his life blend history and legend, the values linked to him, order, ritual, and discipline, reflected the mindset of early Romans. As Rome continued to expand, its population grew more diverse. People from surrounding Latin tribes, Etruscan towns, and even distant regions came to settle in the growing city. This mixture created a community that was both traditional and adaptable. The Romans absorbed practices from others, but always reshaped them into something uniquely their own. The early army also evolved. With increased population and territory, Rome needed stronger defenses. The kings introduced more formal organization. Men were selected for service based on age and equipment, forming the earliest divisions that would evolve into the Roman legions. They trained regularly, learned discipline, and protected the borders of the growing settlement. These changes made Rome more confident and more capable. What had begun as a loose collection of huts now resembled a structured city with recognizable leadership, growing infrastructure, and expanding influence. The Tiber River carried more traffic every year, making Rome a crossroads for trade and communication. By the end of this early era, the hills of Rome were no longer wild or sparsely populated. Pathways had become roads, wooden houses had grown sturdier, and the Central Valley had become the heart of daily life. Rome had taken its first major steps toward becoming a power in the region, yet the city remained young. Its political system was still evolving, its identity still forming, and its ambitions just beginning to awaken. The next generations would bring new kings, significant reforms, and expanding conflicts. These changes would eventually push Rome toward a monumental transformation, the end of monarchy and the birth of the Roman Republic. The story will continue with the slow rise of early kings, growing tensions, and the foundations of Roman society that would endure for centuries. As Rome continued to grow under its early kings, the city gradually shifted from a cluster of simple settlements into a structured community with defined roles, responsibilities, and traditions. The changes during this period were not sudden. They were the result of generations of small adjustments, each shaped by necessity and the character of the people who lived along the Tiber. One of the most influential developments of this era was the formation of social groups that would define Roman identity for centuries. Families with long traditions, experience, and land began to form a respected class within the community. These families, later known as patricians, traced their ancestry to the earliest leaders and elders. Their influence came not only from wealth, but from the belief that their lineages were tied to the very beginnings of Rome. Alongside them lived the larger population of common people, later called plebeians. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and merchants. They worked the fields, created goods for trade, and formed the backbone of the growing city. They did not yet hold political power, but they contributed to every aspect of Rome's growth. Over time, their importance would become undeniable, eventually transforming the structure of Roman society. These early classifications were not strict. They grew gradually, shaped by daily interactions and the natural division of responsibilities. But they laid the groundwork for the complex social system that would dominate Rome during the Republic, a system built on cooperation, tension, negotiation, and shared identity. Another important development was the creation of early religious offices. The Romans believed that proper communication with the gods was essential for the city's survival. Certain individuals were chosen to interpret signs, oversee ceremonies, and maintain sacred traditions. These early priests were not separate from society. They were often influential elders or respected members of prominent families. Their role blended spiritual and civic duties, reinforcing the deep connection between religion and governance. The kings themselves oversaw many major rituals, believing that divine favor protected the city. Festivals marked the passing of the seasons, celebrated harvests, and honored both local spirits and broader deities. These celebrations brought the community together and strengthened the bonds between families, neighbors, and tribes. The city's physical appearance continued to change. Wooden walls were replaced by stronger defenses. Paths became more organized, creating a sense of order among the hills. The Forum Valley, now drained and solid, saw increasing activity. Simple structures were built, storage spaces, meeting areas, and early temples, bringing a sense of permanence to a place that had once been soft earth and marshy ground. Trade expanded steadily. Merchants from nearby Etruscan cities visited more frequently, bringing metalwork, pottery, and new goods from distant regions. At the same time, Greek traders from the southern coast introduced new artistic styles, stories, and tools. These exchanges enriched Roman life, adding new layers to its evolving culture. Rome's strategic location drew attention, not only from peaceful merchants, but also from rival communities. Small conflicts broke out along the borders. These clashes were not yet large wars, but they taught Rome the importance of organization and discipline in battle. The early army, though simple, grew more effective. Men trained more regularly, learned to fight in formation, and followed the commands of the king. These practices created a culture that valued structure, effort, and determination. The Romans believed that strength came from unity, and unity required shared customs, shared rituals, and shared responsibilities. Even at this early stage, the character of Rome, resilient, organized, and ambitious, was taking shape. By the later years of the monarchy, Rome was no longer a modest settlement. It had become a regional presence, a town with influence, structure, and growing confidence. The kings ruled with increasing authority, supported by advisors and respected by the population. But as the city grew stronger, so did the tension between different groups within society. The patricians sought to maintain control. The plebeians wanted more recognition. The kings pushed for central authority. And under the surface of daily life, a quiet struggle began forming, one that would eventually break the monarchy and lead to a profound transformation in Roman history. The final kings of Rome would bring both great achievements and deep conflict. Their actions would guide Rome to the threshold of a new era, an era in which citizens, not kings, would hold power. As the centuries of Rome's early monarchy progressed, each king contributed new layers to the city's structure. Some brought peace and religious order, others focused on construction and expansion, and still others strengthened Rome's military presence. With each reign, Rome became more organized, more fortified, and more confident. Yet beneath this growth, quiet tensions began to form, tensions that would eventually bring the age of kings to an end. Among the kings remembered most clearly in later Roman tradition were those who carried strong Etruscan influence. These rulers introduced more advanced building methods, constructed early temples, and expanded Rome's reach into surrounding territories. Under their guidance, the city grew visibly. Streets became more defined, public areas more structured, and the forum increasingly active. One of the kings traditionally associated with major changes was Tarquinius Priscus, often described as an ambitious leader with a keen understanding of the city's potential. Under his direction, early engineering projects expanded, including improvements to the drainage systems and the beginnings of large communal spaces. He is also connected with organizing Rome's first public entertainments, games and gatherings that brought people from different hills together in shared celebrations. After him came Servius Tullius, a figure linked to important reforms. According to tradition, Servius reorganized the population for administrative and military purposes. He divided citizens into groups based on wealth and equipment, strengthening the army and giving structure to civic responsibilities. He also drew early boundaries around the city, marking the first official limits of Rome's expanding territory. These developments made Rome stronger, but they also created new expectations among the people. The plebeians, who formed the largest portion of the population, contributed greatly to Rome's growth and defense. Yet they remained outside of political decision-making, which was dominated by patrician families and supported by the authority of the kings. As Rome grew, so did the awareness that many citizens carried responsibilities without having influence. Daily life continued to change as well. Markets grew livelier, crafts grew more specialized, and new religious rites blended with older customs. The presence of Etruscan culture brought innovations in art, music, and architecture. Temples became more prominent, adorned with decorative elements influenced by foreign styles. Rome was developing the varied, multicultural character that would define much of its future. But with the rise of each king, the balance of power became more delicate. Authority concentrated in the monarchy sometimes clashed with the interests of influential families. Disputes over land, responsibility, and tradition grew slowly but steadily. Rome remained united when facing external threats, but internally, disagreements simmered beneath the surface. The final king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, known later as Tarquin the Proud, became a symbol of the monarchy's excesses. Later accounts described him as ruling with harshness, taking authority from the Senate, and making decisions without consulting the traditional advisors. Whether these accounts were perfectly accurate or shaped by later Republican sentiment, they reflect a clear truth. The monarchy had reached a breaking point. Under the final kings, Rome achieved remarkable construction and growth. The city expanded more widely along the hills. Defensive structures became stronger. Public spaces took recognizable form. Yet the centralization of power under a single ruler created mounting pressure. The people of Rome valued tradition, shared responsibility, and the wisdom of elders. When a king appeared to act without these principles, doubts began to spread. The patricians, whose authority had once balanced the king's power, grew increasingly uneasy. The plebeians, already carrying the weight of work and military service, grew more aware of their limited rights. These rising tensions were not explosive at first. They built slowly, through years of decisions, reforms, and disagreements. But eventually, the pressure would erupt in a moment that transformed Rome forever: the removal of the monarchy and the birth of a new political system. For now, though, Rome stood on the edge of this change. The hills were full of life, the forum active with trade, and the city stronger than it had ever been. Yet beneath the structure and progress, the foundations of a new era were already forming. We will soon reach the final moments of the monarchy, the event that ends the age of kings and begins the long chapter of the Roman Republic. As the first century moved forward, stability began to return to the empire under the rule of emperors who understood the importance of balance. Among them, one figure stands out for his attempt to restore old Roman traditions and maintain the fragile peace that Augustus had created: Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, inherited an empire that was organized, wealthy, and respected. Yet he governed with caution. He rarely sought glory in war, preferring instead to strengthen the borders and ensure that the provinces remained loyal. His rule brought quieter years, years in which Rome focused inward, on administration, law, and the management of its enormous population. But the calm of Tiberius' reign hid an undercurrent of tension. Behind the scenes, political rivalries deepened. Powerful families in the Senate competed for influence, and whispers of betrayal and plots began to circulate. When Tiberius withdrew from Rome later in his life to live on the island of Capri, the empire fell into the hands of ambitious men who used fear to control the population. The result was a darker chapter, marked by spies, accusations, and mistrust. After Tiberius came Caligula, a young emperor who rose to power with great public support. At first, his rule seemed promising, full of generosity and celebration. But soon his behavior grew unpredictable. Ancient writers describe a ruler whose ambitions stretched far beyond the limits of reason. He demanded divine honors, constructed extravagant monuments, and exhausted the imperial treasury. His reign lasted only 4 years before he was assassinated, ending one of the most chaotic periods in early Roman imperial history. His successor, Claudius, was unexpected, often underestimated due to physical disabilities and a quiet personality. He proved to be an effective administrator. Under Claudius, Rome expanded once again, most notably with the conquest of Britannia, bringing new territories, resources, and peoples into the fold of the empire. Claudius also reformed the legal system and strengthened the bureaucracy, leaving behind a legacy far stronger than many had anticipated. Yet it was his successor, Nero, who would become one of history's most controversial rulers. Nero's early years were guided by wise advisors, and for a time, the empire prospered. But as he grew more confident and more isolated, his leadership shifted dramatically. Art, performance, and personal ambition consumed him. Political opponents were removed, dissent was silenced, and the stability of the empire began to unravel. During Nero's reign, the famous Great Fire of Rome struck, destroying large portions of the city. While the true cause remains unknown, ancient accounts accused Nero of negligence or indifference. Whether true or not, the disaster weakened his reputation severely. Revolts soon rose across the provinces. By the year 68, Nero fled Rome, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His death plunged the empire into civil war. 4 different generals claimed the throne in quick succession, a turbulent period known as the Year of the 4 Emperors. Amid the chaos, one man eventually emerged victorious, Vespasian. His rise ended the unrest and marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian restored order, repaired finances, and began monumental building projects, including the iconic Colosseum, constructed on the grounds of Nero's former palace. What had once symbolized imperial excess now became a gift to the Roman people, a place for gatherings and public spectacles. After Vespasian came his son Titus, whose short reign was marked by both tragedy and compassion. During his rule, the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. He organized relief efforts, providing aid for survivors and showing a rare sense of empathy that endeared him to the Roman people. When Titus died unexpectedly, his brother Domitian succeeded him, ruling with efficiency but also with increasing autocracy. His tense relationship with the Senate led to his assassination, ending the Flavian line. What followed was the rise of the 5 good emperors, a period many historians consider the height of Rome's prosperity and stability. Each emperor adopted a capable successor, ensuring peaceful transitions of power. It was during this period that the empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Iberia to the deserts of Arabia and deep into the lands of Eastern Europe. Under Hadrian, the empire focused less on expansion and more on consolidation. He traveled extensively, inspecting cities, fortifications, and legions. One of his most famous achievements is Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, a massive defensive structure marking the empire's boundary and symbolizing the limits of Roman power. His successor, Antoninus Pius, ruled with remarkable tranquility. His reign was peaceful, prosperous, and marked by fairness. So much so that he earned the name Pius for his devotion to duty and justice. And then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. His reign brought both wisdom and hardship. While he sought a life of reflection and learning, he was repeatedly drawn into conflict along the northern frontiers. His philosophical work, Meditations, written in moments of solitude during military campaigns, remains one of the most admired texts in ancient literature. Yet even Marcus Aurelius could not prevent what was to come. His decision to pass the throne to his biological son, Commodus, marked the decline of Rome's golden age. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, inherited an empire that was powerful but strained. Unlike his father, who spent years defending Rome's borders, Commodus preferred the comfort of the capital. He enjoyed games, performances, and public spectacles, and gradually drifted away from the responsibilities of imperial leadership. Historians describe him as unpredictable, often more interested in portraying himself as a gladiator than as a ruler. While gladiatorial combat had always been a form of entertainment, seeing an emperor take part in such events unsettled many citizens. It blurred the line between emperor and performer and raised questions about the dignity of Rome's leadership. As Commodus grew more self-absorbed, corruption spread throughout the government. His advisors gained increasing influence, some seeking personal profit while others manipulated him for political advantage. The stability that the five good emperors had built over decades began to weaken. Eventually, a conspiracy led to Commodus' assassination in the final hours of the year 192, ending the Antonine dynasty and plunging Rome into uncertainty once again. What followed was a brief but violent period known as the Year of the Five Emperors, as ambitious generals and politicians fought for control. After months of struggle, one man emerged victorious, Septimius Severus, founder of the Severan dynasty. His rule restored order, but also reshaped the empire. Severus strengthened the military above all else. He raised soldiers' pay, expanded their privileges, and relied heavily on their support. This solidified his power, but it also created a dangerous precedent. The army now held significant influence in determining who could become emperor. Loyalty shifted from the institutions of Rome to the generals who commanded strong legions. Upon Severus' death, his sons Caracalla and Geta were meant to rule jointly. But the partnership quickly collapsed. Caracalla, driven by ambition and distrust, had Geta killed and ruled alone. One of his most lasting decisions was granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This expanded the idea of what it meant to be Roman, uniting diverse cultures under a shared identity, though it also increased taxation and administrative demands. Caracalla's reign ended abruptly when he was assassinated, and the empire fell once more into instability. Short-lived emperors rose and fell, some lasting only months. This growing turbulence foreshadowed what would become one of Rome's most difficult eras, the crisis of the 3rd century. From the year 235 onward, the empire entered a time of severe fragmentation. Emperors were overthrown in rapid succession. Borders collapsed under external invasions. Economic troubles deepened as inflation spiraled and trade routes were disrupted. Disease swept across provinces already weakened by conflict. For nearly 50 years, Rome struggled to hold itself together. Entire regions broke away. In the west, the Gallic Empire formed, while in the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra rose to power under the leadership of Queen Zenobia, establishing an independent kingdom. Rome, once unstoppable, now seemed fragile and divided. Yet even in this time of chaos, strong leaders emerged. Among them was Aurelian, a commander who managed to reunite the shattered territories. Through decisive military campaigns, he brought the Gallic Empire and Palmyra back under Roman control, earning the title Restorer of the World. He also began reforms to strengthen the economy and protect the frontiers. His reign was short, but his accomplishments were significant. Rome had been saved from collapse. Despite Aurelian's achievements, the empire remained vulnerable. Over the next decades, rulers continued to struggle with instability until one man brought lasting change: Diocletian. Diocletian understood that the empire had grown too large and complex for any single person to govern effectively. His solution was unprecedented. He divided power among 4 rulers in a system known as the Tetrarchy: 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, called Caesars. This structure was designed to protect borders, share responsibilities, and prevent the rise of rival claimants. He also implemented sweeping reforms, stabilizing the currency, reorganizing the military, and tightening administrative control. These changes strengthened the empire significantly. For the first time in generations, the state functioned with clarity and order. Yet the Tetrarchy depended on cooperation, and after Diocletian stepped down voluntarily, the first Roman emperor ever to do so, the system slowly unraveled. Ambition and rivalry returned, and soon new conflicts emerged among the co-emperors. Out of this turmoil rose a figure who would reshape not only the empire, but the future of Europe: Constantine.